So welcome to our third lecture in our 8th week, tackling the Reformation. And today, in this lecture, I want the student to be able to, we're tackling the English Reformation. And in this lecture, the student will describe the major events of the English Reformation. The student will explore the theological and political nature of the Reformation. And the student will evaluate the impact of the English Reformation on the West and in Anglicanism in general. This is a long and complex story that I love, so I'm only going to give you the highlights. But we do have to start with King Henry VIII here. When we look at the context of Anglicanism, it doesn't really follow the Lutheran branch, and it doesn't really follow the Reformed branch exactly. It looks like a top-down imposition on the populace, a little bit more of a political revolution more than a theological one. The English Reformation took on a more political tone because it had to. And the role of the monarch in the English Reformation was unique in the European Reformations. So let's back up a little bit so we understand why King Henry VIII was as crazy as he seems to us today, right? We have to back up to the Wars of the Roses. And the idea of these wars, it is plural. Wars plural. And it was fought between two houses that had a claim to the British throne. The Red Rose was the House of Lancaster, and the White Rose, which was the House of York. And both sides can trace their claim back to the Plantagenets. But in 1485, at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry VII, who was Lancastrian, defeated Richard III of York. Now, Henry VII, Henry Tudor, had a very weak claim to the throne. He traced his claim back to a queen who had married Jasper Tudor as a second husband, and it was not convincing to the populace. So in Henry VII, Henry Tudor's claim, it was not along the male lines, it was through marriage and through the female lines. Richard, who famously said in Shakespeare, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, lost on the battle. He was executed on the battlefield. Henry ended up marrying Elizabeth of York and uniting the two roses. So when you see the Tudor rose today, it's both a red rose within a white rose. So let's recognize that the Tudor claim to the throne was very weak. So when the succession proceeded from Henry VII, there was great pressure to make sure that it was a legitimately recognized plan of succession. So Henry VII had two sons. His first one, Arthur, named his firstborn son who would inherit the throne after the most famous of all British kings. Unfortunately, Arthur died young, and his second son, Henry, who would then become Henry VIII, he was sent off to study theology. Never thought he'd become king. Older brother dies, and now he is the heir apparent to the throne. Between 1509 and the 1520s, Henry VIII was a devout Catholic. He was conservative in his theological outlook. And this was important for the stability of the Tudor dynasty, because if you have a weak claim to the throne, you have to be very conservative theologically and have the support of the church. So the early Lutheran books were banned. And Henry actually wrote a defense of the Roman Catholic faith, the defense of the seven sacraments, and the Pope bestowed upon him the title of Defensor Fidei, or Defender of the Faith. So when these small reform movements had cropped up in Britain, William Tyndale, John Wycliffe, eventually the White Horse Tavern in Cambridge, they were suppressed because of the need for religious and political stability. Arthur heir to King Henry VII, had married Catherine of Aragon, a very advantageous marriage for someone looking to secure a throne. She was princess from the Spanish house of Ferdinand and Isabella, think Christopher Columbus. And when Arthur died, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, which was very unusual. It was actually against Catholic law to marry your brother's wife. Actually, the Bible says you're not to marry your brother's wife. So he secured a papal dispensation that allowed him to marry his brother's wife. The Pope would regularly grant exceptions to the biblical text to kings in order to keep them happy so they didn't attack the Pope, right? Henry actually does seem to have fallen in love with Queen Catherine. Unfortunately, Queen Catherine, between 1509 and 1525, had several miscarriages. She did produce one female in 1516, Mary Tudor. King Henry VIII fathered an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, but not only is he illegitimate and not strong enough to secure the Tudor claim on the throne, he died at the age of 17. So in 1525, Henry became convinced that the reason why he didn't have a male heir is because he was cursed by God because he married his dead brother's wife. Deuteronomy says that's a no-go, right? He argues that no one believes that the Pope could actually suspend biblical law. And Henry was moved by the idea that he had broken biblical law even if he hadn't broken canon law. Problem was, King Henry's wife, Catherine of Aragon, was the niece of the Holy Roman Emperor, who Charles V, in front of whom Luther appeared, had currently captured Rome and was holding the Pope hostage. So when King Henry VIII appealed to the Pope for a divorce, the Pope was not inclined to give it, even though they have a tradition of being flexible, because he is a prisoner of the uncle of the guy that Henry wants to divorce, right? And King Henry VIII thought this was manifestly unfair because kings should be able to do what they want. Kings have always divorced, remarried, things like this. So in 1527, King Henry VIII begins a love affair with one of the ladies-in-waiting to his queen, Anne Boleyn. And motivated out of a need for a male heir, stability for the realm, motivated out of his love for Anne Boleyn, Henry looked for creative solutions to his divorce problem. And in AD 1529, Henry made the argument, or someone on behalf of Henry made the argument, well, since the Pope is being held captive, we can't appeal to him for a dispensation, so we have to gather the cardinals of Britain and see if they can speak on his behalf. And they adjourned without giving Henry the permission to divorce he wanted. And at this point, Henry is officially willing to sever Britain's commitment to Roman Catholicism. There's recognition of the spiritual authority of the Pope. And Henry first makes a legal argument, praemunire. Praemunire was an ancient British law, an anti-treason law that states that citizens cannot appeal to a monarch outside of England. And he made the argument that the Pope is essentially a monarch that people are appealing to outside of England, and that was against the